It was late at night, and the rain was falling so hard that the windshield wiper could barely handle it. I was returning home after a tiring day at work, driving slowly so as not to lose control on the soaked road. The sound of the water hitting the car was constant, muffling any other noise, but I still managed to notice something strange when I approached a point on the side of the road. There was a car stopped, with the headlights on, throwing a strong light against the rain. I slowed down, curious, trying to understand if anyone needed help. But when I looked more carefully through the blurred glass, I noticed the silhouette of a person in the driver's seat. What gave me goosebumps was that she didn't seem to ask for help or move at all. She just stared at me without blinking, as if she was already waiting for me to pass by. That exchange of glances lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make me completely tense. It didn't look like the look of someone asking for help. It was different, almost challenging. I kept driving, but my whole body was on alert. The rearview mirror showed the lights of the stopped car standing behind, motionless, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was still being watched. I tried to convince myself that it could be just a driver waiting for the rain to subside, but something didn't make sense. The car was on, headlights on, and the person did not make the slightest gesture to signal the need for help. It was as if I was there just to be seen. My heart beat faster every kilometer, and the road, already difficult because of the rain, seemed endless. A few minutes later, almost convinced to forget what I saw, I took another look through the rearview mirror. That's when I felt a cold chill. The headlights that used to be still on the side of the road now moved, getting back on the road. I couldn't tell if it was the same car because of the heavy rain, but everything inside me said yes. I kept my hands firmly on the steering wheel, trying not to accelerate abruptly, but with the feeling of being followed. The road was practically deserted at that time, and every time it slowed down to go through a curve, I noticed the headlights behind me adjusting the speed as well. The sound of the rain hammering the car only increased the tension, because it muffled any other noise. It was as if it was just the two of us on that road, connected by that silent chase. I decided to take a test. I entered a smaller exit, a secondary road that led to an area almost without lighting. It wasn't the shortest way home, but I needed to be sure. As soon as I entered, I waited a few seconds and saw the headlights behind me making the same curve. My heart raced, because at that moment I was sure it wasn't a coincidence. The hands sweated on the steering wheel, and I tried to stay calm while thinking about what to do. I couldn't just stop there in the middle of nowhere, so I accelerated a little more, but without exaggeration, trying to keep my distance. Even so, every time I looked through the rearview mirror, the headlights remained firm, following my every movement, as if there was no hurry, but also without the slightest intention of letting me escape. After a few kilometers, I returned to the main road in the hope of finding some open post, or even another car passing by, but there was no one. The rain only got stronger, making the road almost invisible ahead. It was at that moment that I realized that the headlights behind me suddenly disappeared, as if the car had turned off or disappeared in the dark. I looked several times through the rearview mirror, adjusting the mirror, but there was nothing but the darkness cut by the rain. This sudden disappearance did not bring relief, it brought even more fear. If that car was really behind me all the time, where had it gone? I hadn't made any curves, there were no exits nearby, and yet he just disappeared. I kept driving in silence, trying to control my breathing, but feeling every muscle of my body tense, as if something was still following me without me being able to see. I managed to get home more than half an hour later, but to this day I can't explain what happened on that road. I remember perfectly the fixed gaze inside the car, stopped on the side of the road, and the headlights that followed me for miles. The way they disappeared, without any explanation, was what marked me the most. Sometimes I think it was just someone playing with me, but deep down I feel like there was something else that night. To this day, whenever I drive late at night in the rain, I find myself looking at every car stopped on the side of the road, trying not to relive that feeling. I've never seen anything like it again, but that motionless look is still with me, as if it had been stuck in my memory. And you, what would you do if you passed by a car stopped in the rain and realized that the person inside was just waiting for you to look at her? Story 2. That night the storm seemed to have no end. The rain hit the roof hard, and the noise of thunder made the whole house tremble. I was already lying down trying to sleep when I heard 3 dry knocks on my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was just the wind throwing some branch against the glass, but the sound was too precise, almost rhythmic, as if someone had hit it on purpose. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, listening to the rain fall even heavier. When I gathered courage and got up to look, what I saw left me breathless. There were marks of soaked hands on the glass, perfectly visible, as if someone had pressed their palms against the window. They weren't rainwater blurs, they were whole hands, clearly marked. The first thing I did was check if I had left the window open, but it was well locked inside. What scared me even more was realizing that the glass was cold and wet, but there was nothing to explain those marks so defined. They were tall, at the exact height of an adult, and stood out in the middle of the dripping water. I went back to bed, but I couldn't really lie down. I sat, facing the window, waiting for some movement. My heart beat so loud that it seemed to follow the sound of the storm. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was some neighbor playing a trick, but at this time of night, under heavy rain, it didn't make any sense. Minutes later, when I thought the worst was over, I heard it again. 3 strong beats, exactly the same as the first ones. I jumped out of bed and ran to turn on the light. The marks were sharper now, as if they had been made again, on top of the previous ones. It made me feel as if someone was out there, in the dark, repeating that just to make me panic. I took my cell phone and considered calling the police, but the sound of rain and thunder drowned out anything, and I didn't have the courage to get close to the window to look outside. I ended up locking myself in the room and leaning a chair against the door, as if it would protect me. Even so, I couldn't take my eyes off the glass illuminated by the light of the room, with those hands marked as a reminder that I was not alone. I stood, motionless, listening to the sound of the rain and waiting for any sign that it was over. But suddenly, I noticed something that made me freeze inside. The water dripping on the glass began to distort the marks, but a new palm appeared, fresh, further down, as if someone had put his hand there at that very moment. I didn't see anyone, but the result was there, impossible to deny. It was at that moment that I turned off the light in the room, trying to be invisible. I sat on the floor, hugging my legs, praying that the storm would cover up anything that was happening outside. The minutes dragged on, and I was barely breathing, afraid of drawing attention. When I finally managed to look again, the marks were still there, but no other new ones had appeared. The next morning, I woke up with the calmer noise of the rain and the light coming in through the crack of the curtain. I got up slowly and went to the window, hoping not to see anything. But the marks were still there, although more blurred by time. I went out to the backyard to look for footprints, but the mud was all turned over by the storm, with nothing to help me understand what really happened. I never found out who or what hit my window that night, but to this day I remember the feeling of being watched in the middle of the storm. Since then, I can never sleep peacefully on nights of heavy rain. And you, what would you do if you found fresh hand marks on your window, even though you knew that no one could have left it there? Story 3. It was late at night, and I was driving alone on a deserted highway while the rain fell like a heavy curtain. The windshield wiper couldn't clean the water fast enough, and I could barely see a few meters ahead. The noise of the tires cutting the puddles mixed with the constant sound of the storm, creating a suffocating environment. I just wanted to get home, but that trip seemed to have no end. That's when a flash of lightning lit up the entire track for a second, and I clearly saw the figure of a man walking right in the middle of the road. He was completely soaked, with clothes stuck to his body, and walked slowly, without trying to get out of the way. My immediate instinct was to step on the brake, my heart racing by the possibility of running over someone. But as soon as the headlights lit the asphalt again, there was absolutely no one there. I held the steering wheel firmly, still trying to understand what had just happened. The road ahead was completely empty, only the rain hitting hard against the asphalt. I knew what I had seen, a man standing right in the middle of the track, so real that I could distinguish the way his arms fell heavy next to his body. It wasn't like confusing a shadow or reflection, it was a person. Even so, there was no sign of him anywhere. I slowed down and looked through the mirrors, but behind me there was only darkness and water splashing. I thought about stopping on the side of the road, but the fear spoke louder. The feeling was that if I stopped, I would find something I didn't want to see. So I kept driving, with my hands sweaty on the steering wheel and my eyes fixed on the short beam of light from the headlights. A few kilometers later, still processing what I had seen, I began to question whether it was not just tiredness or the light of lightning playing a trick. But the more I thought, the more convinced I was that it was not imagination. The detail of the wet body, the way it looked heavy in the rain, was too real to be an invention of my head. Suddenly, another flash lit up the road, and for a moment I thought I had seen his silhouette again, this time on the side of the road, as if he had moved in seconds. I blinked several times and forced my sight, but the darkness covered everything again. My heart raced again, and the only thing I could do was accelerate, praying not to cross paths with that figure once again. The road seemed to have no end, and the rain only increased. I felt stuck in a cycle, as if I was driving without really leaving the place. Each lightning brought the fear of seeing him again, and my eyes were already automatically looking for some silhouette on the track. The tension was so much that I barely noticed my accelerated breathing, and the feeling of being accompanied grew every minute. That's when I heard a strange sound coming from inside the car, as if something had hit the bodywork. I looked quickly through the rearview mirror, and for a second, I swore I saw a figure sliding down the side, as if someone had passed his wet hand on the back glass. The shock was so big that I almost lost control of the car. I held the steering wheel tightly and tried to convince myself that it was just the water from the road splashing, but deep down I knew it wasn't that. The noise was distinct, like a solid impact, and the mark on the glass seemed to have been made by a palm. I kept driving without looking back, as if avoiding staring was the only way not to go crazy right there. Minutes later, the road made a long curve and another flash illuminated the track. This time, I didn't see anyone in the middle of the highway, but I had the impression of seeing something standing right ahead, on the edge of the shoulder. When I got closer, I realized that it was nothing but a fallen branch. Even so, the adrenaline had already taken over my body, and every shadow turned into a threat. I managed to get home without seeing anything else, but to this day I think about that night. No matter how much I try to rationalize, I know what I saw that first time. A man standing in the middle of the road, soaked from head to toe. His empty look and sudden disappearance haunt me to this day whenever I drive on rainy nights. I never found out if it was someone real, some illusion caused by the storm, or something I can't explain. But since then, whenever I pass through a highway in heavy rain, I slow down and pay attention to any sign. And you, what would you do if you saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, and seconds later, it simply disappeared? Story 4. On that rainy night, my sister and I were on the couch watching TV when, suddenly, everything went out. The power fell at once, and the house was immersed in darkness, with only the sound of heavy rain and the wind beating against the windows. We were silent for a few seconds, trying to understand if it was just in our house or on the whole street, but the only thing we could hear was the storm outside. A few minutes later, when we were still trying to find a candle or the cell phone to light, we heard heavy footsteps coming from the corridor. It wasn't the snat of the house, it wasn't the noise of the rain. They were clear, slow steps, like someone walking with soaked shoes. Every step made our hearts race more. We took the flashlight from the cell phone, and when the light illuminated the room, there was no one, but the carpet was wet, as if someone had just passed by. We were paralyzed looking at those dark spots that spread through the fabric, clearly marking the path of those who would have crossed the room. The strange thing was that the doors were all locked, and no window had been opened. The feeling was that someone had entered without making noise and disappeared at the same moment. My sister whispered, asking if I was also seeing that, and when I confirmed, despair took over both of them. We tried to follow the marks with the flashlight, but they ended suddenly, right in the middle of the corridor, as if the person had disappeared there. The silence of the house became even more suffocating, and I felt every hair on my body creep. The rain hitting outside only made everything heavier, as if the world had closed around us. None of us dared to get too close, but we also couldn't stand still without understanding what was happening. We decided to turn on the flashlight towards the doors and windows, checking if any had been forced. All were intact, with no sign of entry. This only made the situation more confusing, because there was no logical explanation for those wet footprints. I felt like we were being watched, even without seeing anything. Each shadow projected by the lantern light seemed to take its own shape. My sister suggested that we go up to the room and lock ourselves up until the power comes back. The idea seemed reasonable, but at the same time we had to go through the corridor again where the steps had echoed minutes before. We climbed together, slowly, and at each step we looked back, as if something was going to arise at any moment. When we finally got upstairs, we closed the bedroom door and pushed a dresser against it. In the bedroom, we sat on the floor, illuminating the door with the flashlight, as if that was enough to protect us. Time didn't seem to pass, and each storm noise seemed to gain another weight. In a few moments, I swore to hear something scratching lightly near the stairs, but when I held my breath to be sure, the sound disappeared, mixed with the wind. My sister also said she heard heavy snats, as if someone was walking slowly downstairs. We tried to call our parents, but the cell phone signal was weak, and no call was completed. This only increased the feeling of isolation. The only thing we could do was wait for the power to come back. And deep down, hope that it wouldn't happen again. The flashlight was already starting to lose strength, and every second in the dark seemed to bring us closer to something we didn't want to find. After almost an hour, the lights suddenly returned, and the house was filled with that normal electric buzz after a blackout. We went down to check and, to our surprise, the carpet was completely dry, as if nothing had happened. There were no marks, no signs of water, just the uncomfortable silence that remained after the storm. We looked at each other without understanding, because we had both seen and heard. To this day, we can't explain that night. Whenever it rains hard and the energy flashes, I immediately remember the heavy steps and the wet carpet. I could never stay calm in the dark again during a storm. And you, what would you do if you heard soaked footsteps crossing your house during a blackout? Story 5. It was almost midnight, and I was waiting for the last bus on the line, under a rain that seemed to have no end. The spot was empty, just me trying to protect myself under the wet cover. The sound of the water hitting the asphalt and the cold wind made the environment even more uncomfortable, and all I wanted was for the bus to arrive soon so I could leave. That's when I noticed a figure approaching slowly. It was a man without an umbrella, completely soaked, walking with heavy steps until he stopped a few meters from me. He didn't say anything, didn't ask for information, didn't try to start a conversation. He just stood there, looking straight at me, as if there was nothing else around. At first, I tried to pretend I didn't notice, keeping my eyes on the floor and checking my cell phone every second, even without a signal. But the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. His silence, added to the noise of the heavy rain, created a suffocating climate, as if time had stopped there. I didn't know if I should say something or just wait. With each passing minute, my anxiety increased. The man didn't take his eyes off me, he didn't even move, as if he were stuck in the same place. The rain flowed down his face, but he made no effort to protect himself. That was the strangest. Any normal person would be trying to shelter, but he didn't seem to care about anything, but staring at me. When I finally saw the bus lights approaching on the wet road, I felt an immediate relief. I got up, put the backpack on my shoulder, and was ready to go in. But at no time could I help but notice that the man was still motionless, his eyes fixed on me, as if he was waiting to see my reaction. The heart beat so hard that it seemed to follow the sound of raindrops on the roof of the point. As soon as the bus stopped, I quickly climbed the steps, avoiding looking back. I sat in the first available armchair and took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that everything was fine now. It was at that moment that I realized. The noise of the rain on the asphalt was constant, but I didn't hear the sound of his footsteps moving away, or even him getting on the bus after me. I looked discreetly through the blurred glass, hoping to see him still standing there at the point. But, to my shock, there was no one. The space where he was completely empty, as if it had never existed. The strange thing was that I hadn't had time to run or hide. I would have heard or seen some movement. It was as if he had simply disappeared in the rain. The bus continued the journey, but I couldn't relax. My eyes were fixed on the reflection of the window, hoping to meet that look again at any moment. With each shadow projected by the lampposts, I shrank more in the seat. I couldn't help but think that, if he had gotten into a car or followed the bus, I wouldn't be able to notice. I got home that night with the feeling that I was still being followed. It took me a few minutes to have the courage to get off the bus and walk to the door of the house, always looking over my shoulder. Even after entering and locking everything, I stayed by the window for a while, trying to see if there was anyone standing on the street. But that man's gaze remains with me to this day, as clear as the night it happened. I never took a bus late at night again, without remembering this scene. Whenever it rains and the street is deserted, I'm afraid to see someone standing still, just watching me. And you, what would you do if someone appeared out of nowhere at an empty bus stop, just to stare at you in silence until you disappear? Story 6. The storm that night seemed different, as if the whole house was being tested by the force of wind and rain. I was in the room reading, trying to ignore the noise of thunder, when I heard a bang so loud that I thought a window had broken. It took me a few seconds to realize it was coming from the basement door. It was as if someone had hit her hard or pulled her from the inside out. I took the flashlight that I always leave on the nightstand and went to the kitchen, where there was access to the basement. My heart was already beating faster, just imagining having to open that door in the middle of a storm. When I got close, I saw that she was still swaying slightly, as if she had just been pushed. I took a deep breath, unlocked it, and started going down the wet steps, with the flashlight shaking in my hand. Right on the first flight of stairs, I realized that there were puddles scattered on the basement floor. It didn't make sense, because there were no leaks down there, and the rain had no way to get in that way. The water seemed fresh, as if someone had just left wet marks there. I pointed the flashlight forward, and that's when I realized something that gave me goosebumps from head to toe. Sharp footprints, like barefoot, started near the door and followed in a straight line to the stairs. The strangest part was that the marks went towards the stairs that led back up, but there were no marks coming back. It was as if something had gone up, but had never gone down. I stood still for a few seconds, short of breath, trying to understand. The silence was heavy, interrupted only by the distant noise of the rain hitting the outer walls of the house. I climbed a step slowly, illuminating every corner, hoping to find some sign of who, or what, could have left those marks. The problem was that the dust in the basement was intact, except for the wet footprints. No object had been moved, no box seemed out of place. It was as if that presence had passed there quickly, without interacting with anything, just leaving a trace impossible to ignore. When I got to the top of the stairs, I realized that the door was half open, although I was sure that I had closed it before going down. The detail that made me most nervous was that the latch seemed to have been forced from the inside out, as if something had come out towards the kitchen. I swallowed dryly and pointed the flashlight at the corridor, afraid to see someone standing there, but everything was in absolute silence. With every step I took through the kitchen, the sound of my own heart seemed louder than the storm outside. The floor was dry, but I couldn't help but look back, hoping to see marks continuing down the corridor. The fact that there was nothing only made everything more uncomfortable, as if the footprints had simply stopped on the last step. It was as if whoever came up had disappeared in the air. My sister was sleeping in her room, and for a moment I thought about waking her up, but the fear of looking paranoid stopped me. I decided to search the room and the back doors to make sure no one had entered. They were all locked, with no sign of burglary. Even so, the feeling that she was not alone was unbearable, as if there was someone in absolute silence, watching from a corner of the house. I went back to the kitchen and stood in front of the basement door, still open. The flashlight illuminated the wet steps, and it seemed that the darkness down there pulled me back, as if something was still there waiting. I didn't have the courage to go down again, but I also couldn't just close the door and pretend nothing had happened. Every thunder that echoed made the air in the house vibrate, and that only increased my nervousness. I decided to pull the basement door hard and lock it twice, trying to convince myself that, at least for that night, I wouldn't open it again. But what tormented me was the detail of the footprints. Whoever had left that seemed to have passed exactly where I was now, and the absence of return marks made the question even more frightening. If it went up, where did it go? That night, I took the flashlight with me to the room and left all possible lights on. I was lying down, but sleep didn't come. With each slap of the wood of the old house, I was startled, imagining steps repeating the same heavy sound I had heard before. It was as if any noise now was a confirmation that it was not over. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a squeak coming from the hallway. I jumped out of bed, holding the flashlight, but when I lit it there was nothing. The corridor was empty, silent. The only different thing was a drop dripping on the wood, right in the middle of the ground, as if someone had passed by a few seconds ago. The next morning, I went down again to the basement, already with daylight coming in through the kitchen windows. There was no sign of water on the ground, nor of the footprints I had seen so clearly during the storm. Everything was dry, dusty, as if it had never happened. It was as if the house had erased all traces of that night, leaving only the memories of what I saw. To this day I can't forget the image of those brands stopping at the last step, with no return. I could never find a logical explanation for that. Whenever it rains hard, I lock the basement door twice, even for no apparent reason. And you, what would you do if you saw wet footprints leading to the stairs of your house? But that never came back. Story 7. It was one of those nights when the rain seemed not to give respite, falling heavily against the roof and making the windows vibrate with every thunder. I had called my mother just to talk a little, since the noise of the storm made me restless. We were in the middle of a common conversation when, suddenly, the call was cut off by a strange interference, as if another line had entered. In the middle of that hiss, I clearly heard a hoarse and low voice repeating my name. It wasn't my mother. The voice was masculine, slow, as if it were inside the house itself. I turned off my cell phone immediately, feeling my heart race. That's when I entered the room, I noticed the landline phone off the hook, swinging slightly as if it had just been used seconds before. I stood at the living room door, trying to find a logical explanation. No one else lived with me, and I hadn't used the landline all day. The detail that made me even more uncomfortable was the movement of the wire, swinging slowly as if someone had just released the device. It was impossible not to think that someone could have been there, touching him while I was talking to my mother. I took the landline phone and put it back on the hook, but first I touched the phone and realized that it was hot, as if it had really been used a short time ago. The cold I felt in my stomach was immediate. I checked all the doors and windows, but they were well locked. Even so, the feeling was that there was something or someone inside the house with me in silence. I went back to the room, but I couldn't calm down. I took my cell phone and tried to call my mother again, but the call didn't complete, as if the line was busy. What made it even stranger was that the fixed room, now on the hook, kept emitting a low noise, a continuous hiss, even without being in use. I had the feeling that, if I answered again, I would hear that same voice. I decided to leave all the lights on and sat in the living room, staring at the landline as if it were a threat. With every thunder, I expected to see someone pass through the hallway or move the curtains. The silence of the house was almost suffocating, interrupted only by the noise of the storm. Even with the heavy rain outside, I couldn't get out of my head that that voice had come from inside, and not from the phone line. Suddenly the landline rang. The loud and sudden sound made me almost jump off the couch. I took a deep breath, reached out and answered, but on the other side there was only silence. I stood still for a few seconds, with the phone against my ear, until the same hoarse breath was present, followed by the slow repetition of my name. I threw the phone back on the hook, with my hands shaking. I ran to the window to see if there was anyone on the street, but the rain was so intense that I could barely see the gate. Fear took over me, because everything indicated that it didn't come from outside, but from inside the house. I went to the hallway with the flashlight, opening cabinets and checking the rooms one by one. Everything was apparently normal, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I went back to the living room and stared at the landline, trying to understand how that was possible. I decided to pull the wire from the socket, thinking that this way the noise would stop for good. The silence that came next gave me a brief relief, but it didn't last long. Soon after, I heard a snap coming from the corridor, just like the sound the device made when someone took the phone off the hook. But the phone was already disconnected. It was at that moment that I realized that it was no longer useful to try to find explanations. Something was happening in that house, and I had no idea what it was. I sat back on the couch, hugging my knees, and stayed there until dawn, without sleeping for a minute. The sound of rain hitting the windows was the only thing that kept me aware that the world outside still existed. The next morning, when I finally had the courage to check the phone, it was in place, without noise, as if nothing had happened. I managed to call my mother normally, but I didn't tell her anything so as not to worry her. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself that it was just interference from the storm. But the image of the wire swinging alone, and that voice repeating my name, remained clear in my memory. To this day, I don't know if someone managed to break into the phone line, or if it was something else. All I know is that, since that night, I can no longer be calm when I use the landline. I'm always afraid to hear that hoarse voice again. And you, would you answer the call if on the other side someone called your name in the middle of the rainy dawn? Story 8. It was almost midnight when I finally left work, and the rain had been falling nonstop for hours. The parking lot was almost empty, lit only by a few poles that flashed with the storm. The noise of thunder seemed to shake the air, and each lightning made everything stranger, revealing different shadows between the stopped cars. I just wanted to get to mine soon and leave there. It was then that, in one of these flashes, I noticed a silhouette leaning against a car a few meters away. The figure was motionless, as if watching me, not caring about the heavy rain that came down. I couldn't distinguish details, only the shape of a still, straight body, without making any movement. The next moment, another thunder lit up the parking lot, and the figure was no longer there. I froze for a few seconds, trying to understand if it wasn't just my mind playing tricks because of tiredness. But the sharpness of that silhouette left me in doubt. It didn't look like any reflection or shadow. I looked around carefully, but the parking lot was completely empty, only the wet cars reflecting the light of the poles. The feeling of being watched suddenly grew, making my heart race. I decided to keep walking, but with quick steps. With every thunder, I expected to see the figure again in some corner, between the cars. I didn't see anything, but the tension only increased, as if there was something hidden beyond what the light showed. When I finally reached my car, my hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped the key on the floor. Before entering, I looked around once again, illuminated by another flash of lightning. For a moment, I was sure to see something move between the farthest cars, but when I fixed my gaze, there was nothing. The noise of the rain hitting the hood echoed loudly, but it still seemed that I could distinguish steps if someone approached. It was this thought that made me throw the backpack into the car and get in at once, locking the doors immediately. Inside the car, the sound of the storm was muffled, but the feeling of insecurity did not diminish. I started the engine and turned on the headlights, sweeping the parking lot with the light. Everything seemed normal, but there was something wrong in the air. The detail that made me shudder was to realize that the car where I saw the figure before was with the rear door open, wide open to the rain. I stood still for a few seconds, looking at that open door, trying to find the courage to believe that it was just coincidence. But deep down I knew it wasn't. No one would leave a car like that in the middle of a storm, much less without being around. The light from the headlights reflected on the dark interior of the vehicle, and with each lightning it seemed that something was moving inside, although I couldn't see clearly. I engaged the gear and started driving slowly towards the exit, but I couldn't take my eyes off the rearview mirror. With each blink of the lampposts, I had the impression of seeing a shadow emerging behind the car, as if it were accompanying me. My chest seemed to tighten more every second, and I just wanted to get rid of that parking lot as soon as possible. When I finally got close to the exit gate, another flash lit up the entire courtyard at once. And it was at that moment that I saw, for a moment, the same silhouette standing right in the middle of the parking lot, motionless just like before. It was impossible that he had moved so fast to that point. The thunder came soon after, and the moment the darkness returned, the figure had disappeared again. I accelerated without thinking twice, crossing the gate and entering the wet road. My heart was beating so hard that I barely noticed the noise of the engine. I looked through the rearview mirror several times during the way back, but I didn't see anything else. Still, the feeling that someone had accompanied me there stuck to me like a weight, even when I got home. The next morning, when I returned to work, the parking seemed absolutely normal. No car with the door open, no mark that indicated something strange. But I knew what I had seen the night before, and the feeling still accompanied me. To this day, whenever I cross that place on rainy nights, I feel my body stop, waiting for another flash to reveal that motionless figure again. I never found out if that was some kind of hallucination caused by fatigue, or if there was really someone watching me in that storm. The fact is that, since then, I avoid walking alone in empty parking lots as much as possible. And you, have you ever been through a situation in which you swore to see someone, but the next moment the person simply disappeared? Story 9. That night, the storm didn't seem to give rest. The noise of the rain hitting the roof was so loud that I could barely sleep. That's when I noticed a strong leak falling near the head of the bed. Annoyed, I got up to get a towel and put it underneath, thinking it would solve it by the next morning. But when I came back, I came across something impossible to explain. The whole mattress was completely soaked, as if someone had thrown buckets of water on top. The towel I was carrying became useless in the face of that scene. The strangest thing was that the window was still tightly closed on the inside, with no sign of crack or water ingress. I touched the mattress with my palm, and the water flowed through my fingers, so soaked that it seemed to have come out straight under a shower. The floor around the bed was also wet, forming small puddles, but the ceiling and walls were intact, with no sign of infiltration. It was as if the water had arisen only there, concentrated in the place where I slept. My first instinct was to check the window again. I ran my hand through each crack, tested the lock, pushed the glass hard, but everything was firm and dry. Outside, the storm continued, but there was no point where that absurd amount of water could have entered. This made me even more nervous, because it eliminated any logical explanation. I went back to the room trying to reason, but every second the discomfort increased. The mattress seemed heavier, as if the water had been poured all at once. The humid smell took over the environment, strong and sudden, as if something had happened just seconds before. The feeling was that I had left for a moment and missed exactly the moment when everything happened. I decided to pull the mattress to see if there was any burst pipe or infiltration coming from the floor, but nothing explained. The wood of the bed was dry, and the floor under the mattress showed no cracks or water ingress. It was as if the liquid had appeared only on the surface, in an impossible way. While trying to understand, I noticed something even stranger. The water had no color or smell of plumbing. It was crystal clear, as if it had just been removed from a clean bucket. This made me rule out once and for all any chance of being a problem in the house. The idea of someone having entered without me noticing began to roam my head, even though all the doors and windows were locked. I took my cell phone to call my mother, but I realized that there was no signal. The storm may have knocked down the network, but the coincidence made me restless. I looked back at the mattress, now with the uncomfortable feeling that it wasn't just a domestic problem. It was as if someone had chosen precisely the place where I slept to cause that. I decided to sleep on the sofa in the living room, but before leaving the bedroom, I took one last look. It was then that I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. There were dark marks on the edge of the mattress, like prints of wet hands that had pressed the fabric. The format was too sharp to be random. That made my stomach turn, because it indicated that someone or something had touched there. I left almost running and locked the bedroom door, even though I knew it wouldn't make a difference if there was really someone inside. I threw myself on the couch with a thin blanket and stayed awake for hours, listening to the rain outside and waiting for any sign of movement. The silence inside the house was absolute, but the smell of humidity seemed to have spread throughout the entire corridor. When I finally fell asleep, I woke up suddenly with a noise coming from the room. It sounded like the sound of something heavy being dragged on the wet floor. I took the flashlight and walked to the door, but I didn't have the courage to open it. I leaned my ear against the wood and only heard the slow dripping of the water, as if there were still leaks inside, even though I knew that nothing dripped from the ceiling. I waited until dawn to create courage to open the door. When I entered, the mattress was dry, as if nothing had happened. The towels I had left on the floor were folded over the chair, something I certainly hadn't done. The entire room seemed untouched, except for the humid smell that still hovered in the air, too strong to be the result only of my imagination. That day, I couldn't focus on anything but what had happened. The scene of the soaked mattress and the wet hand marks got stuck in my mind. I started to avoid sleeping in that room whenever it rained hard, preferring to stay in the living room. I never found a plausible explanation, and to this day I don't know if someone entered the house that night or if I witnessed something that goes beyond what I can understand. Whenever the rain starts to fall heavily and the wind hits the windows, I feel my body get alert, waiting for everything to happen again. The fear is not only of water, but of the possibility of waking up and finding that inexplicably wet mattress again. And you, could you sleep peacefully after seeing wet hand marks on your own bed? Story 10. But don't leave yet, because something unexpected comes after this one. I've always had the habit of checking the balcony on nights of heavy rain. Maybe because I live alone, I created this routine to feel safer. That particular morning, the storm was so intense that I could barely hear my own footsteps inside the house. With every thunder, the walls vibrated, and the noise of the water against the glass seemed deafening. That's when I decided to pull the curtain from the glass door that leads to the balcony. At the exact moment I opened it, I saw a man standing there, completely soaked, staring inside. He didn't move, he didn't try to get in, he just stood still, as if he was waiting for something. The shock was so great that I jumped back before even thinking about what to do. I ran to the switch and turned on all the lights in the living room, hoping that it would scare whoever it was. But when I looked at the balcony again, it was completely empty. The man had disappeared without leaving any sound, no movement. For a moment, I even thought my mind had played a trick, but then I noticed the detail that froze me inside. The balcony floor was covered by wet, sharp footprints, coming and going in different directions, as if the person had been walking there for a while. The trail continued to the gate, and suddenly stopped, as if it had disappeared into the air. There was no sign of anyone running down the street, no noise except the rain. It was as if he had appeared and disappeared out of nowhere. I stood still for a few seconds trying to reason, but fear spoke louder than any logic. I ran to the door and locked it with the extra lock, even though I knew that the glass didn't offer so much security. I took my cell phone to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I say? That I saw a man on the balcony who just disappeared when I turned on the lights? They would probably think it was just a reflex or hallucination. I decided to take another look, this time from afar, from the kitchen window. The balcony seemed normal, but the wet marks were still there, increasingly evident with the lighting. I knew I hadn't imagined anything. The most disturbing detail was noticing that some of the footprints pointed directly to the glass door, stopping a few centimeters away, as if he had stood there for a long time watching me. I went back to the room, trying to convince myself that, whoever it was, I had already left. But the thought that that man had managed to get to the balcony without me hearing anything left me on full alert. The rain was beating hard, but I still should have noticed some sound of footsteps, some noise of the gate opening. The complete silence made everything stranger. I sat on the couch, but I couldn't relax. I took a heavy object that was nearby, just to have it in hand in case something happened. With every thunder, I ran my eyes through the windows, hoping to see that figure again. He didn't show up anymore, but the presence seemed to have stayed. It was as if the house had absorbed that fear and was returning me in the form of oppressive silence. Around 3 in the morning, the storm began to lose strength. I took advantage of the break between thunders to peek at the balcony again. That's when I realized that some of the footprints had disappeared, as if they had dried too fast, while others still shone wet under the light. That didn't make sense, since they had all been left at the same time. The worst thing was noticing that there was a new mark different from the others. A lonely footprint, facing inward, leaning against the glass door, as if someone had taken a step towards my living room, but had not crossed. I got stored on the spot, feeling my body refused to get close to that door. I didn't know if I had the courage to wait until dawn there, with that mark staring at me. I waited for the morning to come without sleeping, sitting on the couch and looking at that door. When the sun finally came out, I ran to open the curtain, and the balcony was clean, with no sign of the previous night's footprints. Not even the lonely mark leaning against the glass door. It seemed that the storm had erased all traces, as if nothing had happened. To this day I don't know who, or what, was on my balcony that rainy dawn. The memory of that soaked figure looking inside my house still gives me goosebumps whenever it rains hard. And you, would you have the courage to open the curtain if you knew that someone could be standing there, outside, watching? You've made it to the end. Thank you for listening until now. But before we close, I have one last story for you. I was returning from a long trip when the rain tightened in a way I had never seen before. In a few minutes, the road began to flood, and I had to stop the car on the side of the road, since the water rose fast and the visibility was almost zero. I stayed there, with the wiper at maximum and the headlights reflecting on the asphalt covered with water, waiting for the storm to give a truce. It was at that moment that, through the rearview mirror, I noticed something that made me hold my breath. A figure walked slowly through the water, straight towards me. The dragged way of the steps didn't seem natural, as if each movement was too heavy. With each lightning, I could see the silhouette better, but never the face. My whole body was on alert, and all I could do was lock the car doors. The rain hit the roof of the car so hard that I could barely hear my own thoughts. The figure got closer and closer, and I squeezed the steering wheel hard, trying to decide whether to accelerate at once, even with the flooded track. My heart seemed to follow the rhythm of the storm, beating uncontrollably. Then, in the blink of an eye, the situation changed. I looked through the rearview mirror again, and no longer saw the silhouette coming down the road. Instead, she was standing right behind the car. The detail that terrified me was that there was no time for someone to move so fast in the water. When I turned to look through the back window, there was nothing but the pitch of the night. Fear took over me in a way I had never felt. I pressed the flasher button and stood there, motionless, trying to take a deep breath and convince myself that it was nothing more than a reflection of the rain and the lights. But deep down I knew I had seen the silhouette, clear and sharp, a few steps from my car. I was in absolute silence for a few minutes, until a loud snap echoed through the trunk, as if something heavy had hit back there. I almost let out a scream, but I held back. I started the engine and got ready to leave there, even with the flood blocking part of the highway. At that moment, the idea of standing still seemed much more dangerous than risking moving on. I started gearing slowly and started driving along the track partially covered with water, hoping the car wouldn't go out. The windshield wiper fought against the rain, and each lightning lit the road in a different way, revealing strange shapes in the reflection of the water. I looked through the rearview mirror all the time, hoping to see the figure again behind me. After a few minutes, already further away from the point where I had stopped, I felt a momentary relief. That's when I noticed something even worse. There were wet hand marks on the rear window of the car, as if someone had just stopped there. The problem is that I hadn't stopped anywhere else since I left the shoulder. I tried to keep my focus on the road, but with every thunder my eyes went to the rear view mirror, hoping to see that figure again. The detail of the marks on the glass made me even more terrified, because there was no way they would have appeared there alone. I was locked inside the car all the time, and no one could have approached without me noticing. When I finally reached a safer stretch of the highway, I parked under a viaduct to breathe. I went down with my heart racing and checked the back of the car. The marks were still there, dripping as if they had just been made, even under the constant rain. It was enough for me to run back inside and continue traveling without looking back. When I got home, hours later, I barely had the courage to get out of the car. I waited until dawn to look again, but the marks had disappeared as if they had never existed. The car was completely clean, only covered by the mud from the road. I was left with that overwhelming doubt. Did my fear make me imagine everything, or was there really something there with me that night? To this day, whenever I hit the road on days of heavy rain, I feel my stomach turn just remembering. I could never stand on a side of the road again without looking through the mirrors all the time. And you, would you have the courage to wait inside the car if you saw someone walking towards you in the middle of a flood? Thank you for staying until the end of this video. It's amazing to have you here accompanying me until the end of the stories. If you liked it, leave your comment telling what was the story that moved you the most. And if you are not yet registered, sign up so you don't miss the next ones. Until next night of scary stories.